Most people think they understand why someone cheats. The explanation usually comes ready-made: lack of character, impulsiveness, dissatisfaction. Quick explanations are comfortable because they keep the more uncomfortable question at a distance. What happens when cheating isn't driven by desire for another person, but by something unresolved inside the person who cheats? When it's not about pleasure, adventure, or rebellion, but about a confused attempt to deal with inner tension? There's a rarely discussed aspect of this topic. Many people who cheat aren't trying to destroy a relationship. They're trying to hold together something they can no longer manage emotionally. In those cases, cheating doesn't appear as a clear choice, but as a symptom. It shows up when certain conflicts can no longer be put into words, when someone no longer knows how to explain what they're feeling to their partner or even to themselves. And instead of facing that emptiness directly, they create a parallel exit, not because it's easy, but because it's quiet. This video doesn't start with the question, how could someone do this? It starts with a more uncomfortable one. What does cheating reveal about how we deal with desire, identity, guilt, and the fear of losing ourselves inside a relationship? Understanding this isn't about justifying behavior. It's about seeing more clearly something that's usually treated only with judgment, and therefore rarely understood. Before we continue, a quick invitation: like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep this space alive and allows for deeper conversations that are usually avoided or oversimplified. Now, let's get to what matters. When people talk about cheating, the conversation almost always starts with the act itself. What was done, what was hidden, the impact on the person who finds out. But that starting point is often misleading. It highlights the final outcome while leaving the psychological process that led there in the shadows. The more interesting question isn't, why does someone cheat? But what has to be happening internally for cheating to start making sense? Because contrary to what we like to believe, no one wakes up one day deciding to break their own emotional coherence. Cheating usually emerges when that coherence has already been compromised for quite some time. There's a comforting idea that cheating is always a sign of lack of love or excess desire. In practice, many cases have little to do with either. What often shows up instead is a poorly processed conflict between identity and attachment, between who the person feels they are or need to be, and the role they occupy within the relationship. Relationships require continuous adaptation. Over time, expectations pile up, versions of the self solidify, and unspoken agreements stop being revisited. When this internal structure becomes too rigid, desire doesn't disappear. It shifts, and it doesn't always find a healthy way to be expressed. In these cases, cheating isn't just about another person. It functions as a parallel zone, a space where someone can experience sensations they no longer access within their relational life. Sensations like being seen differently, acting without the weight of accumulated history, or simply feeling capable of desiring and being desired without so many layers of meaning attached. This doesn't make cheating any less painful for the person who is betrayed, but it changes how we understand it, because what's at stake isn't just a breach of trust, it's emotional disorganization. A central element here is self-deception. People who cheat rarely see themselves as dishonest. On the contrary, they often build very sophisticated internal narratives to sustain their behavior, narratives that ease guilt, minimize impact, or postpone responsibility, not out of conscious malice, but because admitting the real conflict would require facing losses that feel too costly. These narratives act as psychological shock absorbers. They allow the person to continue seeing themselves as reasonable while living with a growing contradiction between declared values and actual behavior. The wider that gap becomes, the more mental energy is spent keeping it out of sight. Another rarely discussed aspect is the role of inadequacy. Many people cheat not because they feel powerful, but because they feel insufficient. The experience of cheating offers, even if temporarily, a sense of validation that was missing. Not moral validation, but existential validation. A reminder that they are still desirable, interesting, chosen. This kind of validation is unstable, but intense. And precisely because of that, it can be addictive. Not because it resolves the conflict, but because it suspends it for a moment. The problem is that the conflict returns later with greater force, accompanied by guilt and fear of exposure. Psychology shows that contradictory behaviors rarely come from simple impulses. They are the result of accumulated tensions that never found language. When feelings aren't named, they look for exits. And those exits aren't always conscious or constructive. This video doesn't propose defending cheating, nor automatically condemning it. It proposes something harder: understanding without simplification. Because as long as cheating is treated only as a moral failure, it will keep repeating itself as a psychological pattern. As this video unfolds, the focus shifts away from the act itself and toward what it's trying to compensate for. What cheating reveals about intimacy, fear of loss, the need for recognition, and the human difficulty of sustaining uncomfortable truths within a relationship. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain involved, but it expands awareness. And awareness is the first step toward breaking cycles that, when left unexamined, repeat themselves with new justifications, and the same emptiness. There's a quiet idea that runs through many relationships and is almost never said out loud, that after a certain point some truths become too dangerous to express, not because they're cruel, but because they threaten the stability that's been built. That's where internal conflict starts to gain strength. Cheating often emerges when someone realizes they can no longer sustain two things at the same time: the image they need to maintain and the desires they keep feeling. Instead of choosing one or the other, they create a third path, not as a conscious solution, but as emotional postponement. The problem is that this third path comes at a high cost. It requires compartmentalization. The person begins to divide their life into zones that don't fully communicate with each other. In one, there's commitment, history, public identity. In the other, there's relief, excitement, a temporary sense of freedom. As long as these zones stay separate, the conflict feels manageable. When they start to overlap, the suffering intensifies. This kind of internal split doesn't come out of nowhere. It often forms in people who learned early on to avoid direct emotional confrontation. People who associate conflict with loss, rejection, or failure. For them, cheating isn't a conscious act of defiance against the other person, but a disorganized attempt to avoid losing everything at once. There's also an important psychological factor tied to identity. Many people enter relationships carrying very specific versions of themselves. Over time, those versions can become too narrow. Desire then starts to function as a reminder of unlived possibilities. Cheating appears as a space where the person can explore parts of themselves that were compressed or left behind. That helps explain why, in many cases, cheating isn't accompanied by plans to leave. On the contrary, there's attachment, there's care, there's fear of losing the primary bond. The contradictory behavior isn't a sign of cynicism, but of internal fragmentation. The person wants to preserve the relationship while also escaping the discomfort it has begun to generate. Another rarely discussed point is the connection between cheating and emotional silence. When feelings stop circulating honestly within a relationship, they don't disappear, they shift. What doesn't find space in conversation finds an outlet in behavior. And behaviors, when not understood, end up carrying meanings the person was never able to put into words. Cheating also feeds on a common illusion, the belief that consequences can be controlled. Many people think that by keeping everything secret, they can protect the other person from pain and themselves from guilt. This logic ignores a fundamental aspect of human psychology. Long-term secrets require constant vigilance, and constant vigilance is exhausting. Over time, the energy that should be available to the relationship gets redirected toward maintaining the internal split. That creates emotional distance, irritability, confusion. What started as an attempt to relieve tension ends up generating another, more complex one. It's important to say this clearly. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't make cheating acceptable, but it does make the phenomenon more intelligible. And what's understood has less power to repeat itself automatically. In the next sections, the reflection goes even deeper. The question shifts from why does this happen to what is this behavior trying to resolve and why is it horse, and why does it fail? And because cheating, despite promising relief, almost never delivers what it promises. It exposes something essential about the human difficulty of sustaining desire, truth, and attachment at the same time. And that's where the conversation really becomes interesting. The person who cheats almost always believes they're managing a private problem without causing a disaster around them. That belief is part of the mechanism. It allows the behavior to continue without forcing the person to face what they're actually doing, replacing one form of intimacy with another while trying to preserve the appearance that nothing has changed. This is where cheating stops being just an act and starts revealing something deeper, how each person understands intimacy. Many people confuse intimacy with coexistence, shared routines, accumulated history, familiarity. That creates a sense of closeness, but it doesn't guarantee emotional presence. Real intimacy requires exposure. It requires saying what's difficult. It requires risk. And for many people, risk feels intolerable. So cheating shows up as a shortcut to sensations the person can't sustain within the primary relationship. A shortcut to being desired without having to explain themselves. A shortcut to novelty without negotiation. A shortcut to living a version of themselves without facing the fear of being judged. The problem is that emotional shortcuts have a cruel trait. They feel light at first and grow heavy over time. Guilt enters as an ambiguous signal. It's not just regret. Often it's the first real contact with the seriousness of one's own behavior. But instead of leading to honest conversation, guilt usually pushes the person toward more compensatory strategies. They try to be kinder, more present, more attentive, not because they're more connected, but because they're trying to internally balance their self-image. It's as if they're telling themselves, if I'm good enough here, what happens on the other side won't count as much. And this creates a strange relationship with morality. The person begins negotiating with themselves. Shame, when it appears, is even more dangerous. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame whispers, there's something wrong with me. And when shame takes over, the person tends to hide even more, not just from their partner, but from themselves. This creates a psychology of duplication. One part tries to stay in control, another tries not to feel. And the more the person tries not to feel, the more they lose access to their emotional center. There's also a specific psychological effect that keeps the cycle going: dissociation. Not in the extreme clinical sense, but as a daily mechanism for separating experiences in order to survive contradiction. The person learns to live as if they were inhabiting different worlds, each with its own rules. For a while this works, until the body starts signaling the cost: diffuse anxiety, irritability with no clear cause, difficulty being present, a constant sense of owing something. That's the price of sustaining a split truth. What's most striking and most painful is that cheating rarely delivers what it promises. If the person was seeking to feel alive, they get moments of intensity and return to a deeper emptiness. If they were seeking validation, they receive a dose that quickly demands another. If they were trying to escape internal conflict, they simply add a new one, more dangerous and harder to put into words. And here, an essential turning point appears. Cheating isn't just about desire. It's about emotional regulation, about how a person deals with tension, frustration, fear, neediness, insecurity, and the feeling of being trapped. Emotionally mature people are able to say, something is wrong between us, before acting outside the bond. People who never learned how to do that tend to act first and understand later, so this is the uncomfortable part. In many cases, cheating is a symptom of emotional illiteracy. Not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of internal language to hold difficult truths without collapsing or escaping. The behavior becomes the sentence the person can't formulate, and that's why understanding the psychology of cheating is so necessary. Not to soften the pain of the betrayed, nor to turn the one who cheats into a victim, but to see the mechanism for what it is: a failed attempt to sustain two incompatible needs at the same time, and the human cost of that failure for everyone involved. When cheating comes to light, whether it's discovered, confessed, or simply sensed, something deeper than a breach of trust happens. What breaks isn't just the agreement between two people, but the narrative that held the relationship together. That quiet sense of "we know who we are" collapses. And that creates a kind of emotional vertigo that's hard to contain. For the person who cheated, this moment often feels like an internal collapse. Not only because of the fear of losing the other person, but because of a direct confrontation with their own inconsistency. They're forced to look at a version of themselves they had been carefully avoiding, not the version that makes a one-time mistake, but the one that chose to sustain a double life. That confrontation is rarely simple because it requires letting go of justifications that had been serving as psychological protection. At this point, it's common for a desperate attempt to quickly reorganize the story to emerge: rushed apologies, absolute promises, intense declarations. All of this can be sincere, but it can also be a way to silence the anguish that surfaces when identity goes into crisis. Urgency, more often than not, signals an inability to stay with the discomfort required to truly understand what happened. For the person who was betrayed, the psychological impact follows a different path. The pain isn't just about what was done, but about what can no longer be trusted. Reality itself fractures. Small memories are revisited. Gestures that once felt neutral take on new meaning. A constant question appears: what else did I not see? This state isn't paranoia. It's the mind's legitimate attempt to rebuild an emotional map that was suddenly invalidated. What both people share is a loss of internal reference. Each is confronted with questions they weren't prepared to answer. The one who cheated has to face why they couldn't sustain their own truth within the relationship. The one who was betrayed has to deal with the collapse of a trust that once organized their sense of intimacy and safety. This is where many relationships enter a dangerous cycle. Instead of deepening the understanding of what led to the betrayal, there's an attempt to quickly restore the appearance of normalcy. The problem is that normalcy without understanding becomes nothing more than organized silence. And organized silence doesn't heal wounds. It just pushes them into less visible places. From a psychological perspective, cheating reveals something essential about how we deal with conflict and vulnerability. Relationships that can't tolerate emotional discomfort tend to produce indirect behaviors. When it's not possible to say "I'm dissatisfied," "I'm confused," or "I'm afraid of losing who I am," those emotions look for alternative exits. Cheating is one of them, and one of the most destructive, precisely because it mixes desire with secrecy. Another important aspect is the fantasy that understanding the reason for the betrayal will bring immediate relief. Understanding helps, but it doesn't solve everything. Because what hurts isn't only the reason, it's the realization that the relationship reached a point where certain truths couldn't be spoken in time. That requires deeper psychological work than simple explanations can offer. Some people try to turn cheating into a definitive dividing line: either everything ends or everything is forgiven. But emotional reality is usually more complex. There is grief for what was lost, even when the relationship continues. There is anger mixed with a desire for closeness. There are moments of clarity followed by emotional setbacks. This movement isn't weakness, it's processing. Psychology shows that rupture experiences expose the quality of a bond long before the final act. Cheating doesn't create problems out of nowhere, it amplifies cracks that were already there, sustained by silence, accommodation, or fear of conflict. This doesn't reduce the responsibility of the person who cheated, but it broadens the understanding of what was truly at stake. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept is this: cheating isn't just a mistake within a relationship, it's an uncomfortable mirror of how each person has learned to deal with desire, frustration, and truth. And looking into that mirror takes courage, because it doesn't offer simple answers or quick exits. This is where the reflection needs to shift. Less focused on the event itself and more attentive to what it reveals about emotional maturity, internal boundaries, and the ability, or inability, to sustain intimacy without losing oneself. Talking about people who cheat isn't comfortable because it forces us to let go of easy answers. It forces us to accept that many times the problem isn't just the visible act, but the way people learn to relate to truth, desire, and conflict over the course of their lives. Maybe the most honest question isn't whether someone is capable of cheating. Most people are. The more relevant question is, at what point does someone lose the ability to sustain difficult conversations without resorting to emotional shortcuts? Because that's where the risk begins to take shape. Cheating doesn't arise only from a lack of love. It arises from difficulty dealing with ambivalence, holding affection and frustration at the same time, admitting that something has changed without immediately turning that into guilt or abandonment. When a person can't tolerate that internal complexity, they look for solutions that relieve tension, even if those solutions cause greater damage later. There's something important to say here. Understanding doesn't mean excusing. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind cheating doesn't erase the pain of the person who was betrayed, nor does it remove responsibility, but it expands awareness, and awareness is the only place where different choices can actually emerge. For those who have cheated, this reflection can be uncomfortable because it dismantles all justifications. It shows that the problem wasn't merely circumstantial, inevitable, or solely caused by the other person. It reveals that there was an emotional limit that wasn't recognized in time. And recognizing that requires maturity because it means admitting that certain truths were avoided. For those who were betrayed, understanding these mechanisms isn't an invitation to automatic forgiveness. It's an invitation to clarity. Clarity about what actually broke, about what needs to be rebuilt, or not, about which emotional conditions are non-negotiable moving forward. Perhaps the most transformative insight here is realizing that healthy relationships aren't those free from desire outside, but those capable of holding desire inside without silence, excessive fear, or games of concealment. Relationships where truth isn't used as a weapon, but as a tool for ongoing adjustment. Cheating is often treated as an isolated event, but psychologically it's almost always the result of a long process of unspoken internal misalignments. When that process is ignored, it tends to repeat itself, with different people, in different contexts, under new justifications. Maybe true prevention of cheating doesn't lie in absolute promises, but in something harder and more human: the willingness to revisit agreements, name discomfort early, and accept that intimacy requires constant exposure. Not perfect exposure, but possible exposure. In the end, the psychology of cheating is less about infidelity and more about emotional maturity, about the ability to sustain who you are without splitting your life into secret compartments, about learning to speak imperfect truths before they turn into destructive behavior. If this video served any purpose, let it be this: to broaden perspective, not to judge more, nor to justify everything, but to understand better. Because human relationships don't fail only because of a lack of love. They often fail because of a lack of emotional language, and that is a language that can be learned. Before wrapping up, here's an invitation. If this topic resonated with you in any way, leave a comment. It doesn't have to be a finished answer. It can be a question, a reflection, or simply something that lingered. This space exists for conversations that usually don't fit into fast, superficial places. Reading what you think is also part of this reflection. See you next time.